Welcome to Atlas. In this episode, one sits down with Gary May, the 7th Chancellor of UC Davis. Enjoy.
I think it'd be great if we start off with your early life, childhood story. What was your upbringing like? Were there any sort of early experiences you had that initially drew your interest into electrical engineering as you went to college?
I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was a teacher, and my father was a postal worker. The interest I gained for science and engineering started really with doing jigsaw puzzles and erector sets and Legos and science fiction, comic books, all those sorts of things got me interested in what was possible with science. And eventually that led to me pursuing a degree in engineering.
You mentioned thinking about what's possible with science. Do you think you were a kid that was always kind of stuck in his imagination and thinking about what could be?
Yeah, that's where the science fiction came in. I think my imagination would be pretty broad and wild, and I would wonder why things existed in a certain way and what was possible if we were to do things a different way, or if we had a way to build things that would allow us to live in a different way. So that aligns very well with the way engineers think or like to think and like to operate.
Yeah. Were there any sort of like pieces of sci-fi content or maybe made up technologies within sort of like sci-fi content that really captured your imagination?
Sure. You know, my favorite show was Star Trek, and I'm old enough that the original series was the series I watched. And so, you know, the flip phone, the desktop computer, all those sorts of things, those concepts originated in Star Trek. We don't have a transporter yet, but, you know, maybe one day.
I always wonder, as a person that's kind of gotten into to see technology sort of evolve throughout a couple of decades, was your expectation of how fast technology would advance met with how fast technology actually advanced throughout your lifetime? Like, what does that kind of expectation look like?
No, you know, technology is kind of growing, advancing at an exponential rate. I think, you know, for a long time, it felt like things were progressing, but progressing slowly. But now, we talked about this as you were setting up, now your phone that you hold in your hands has more computing power than a computer the size of this room back in the day. And it can do other things other than compute, like it can record this podcast, and it can show you all the pictures that you want to look at and videos you want to look at, and acts like a radio, and it has your music in it, and all those sorts of things that were not possible. Were possible, but it required half a dozen different kinds of devices just maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah, and you know, you're a member of the microelectronics group at Georgia Tech, and my understanding is that a lot of your research was sort of centered around computer-aided manufacturing.
That's right.
There's a student, you know, watching this, and they've never heard of computer-aided manufacturing before. How would you kind of describe the field, and also maybe contextualize where computer-aided manufacturing was at the time when you were doing research?
Sure. So computer-aided manufacturing is used in a lot of different subfields, but in my case, I was trying to figure out how to more efficiently manufacture integrated circuits. Integrated circuits are computer chips, as they're commonly called, or the brains of computers, right? So if you open up your phone or your PC or your desktop computer, you would see a board that's full of these chips that have different functions. And my research is aimed at figuring out how to make those chips in a way that's more affordable, efficient, reliable, and each of those chips probably requires hundreds and sometimes thousands of steps, if you're making a microprocessor. And each of those steps can impact the quality of the final product. So what we worked on was actually an early application of AI. You know, we used neural networks to figure out how to model those processes and how to control those processes and diagnose manufacturing issues in those steps that are required to make the integrated circuits and make them more efficient.
Are you familiar with David Patterson?
I am.
Yeah, I had him on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and it was really cool getting his perspective on, and also his sort of experience leading the RISC project at Berkeley. And it's made me very curious, like in the context of computer architecture, how much of making processes more efficient is about rethinking the processes versus adding sort of layers on top of the processes? And maybe if, that's relevant to your research.
That's a great question. So Dave, I went to Berkeley also for grad school, so I've met Dave, I think, when I was a graduate student way back when. And his work is more at the computer architecture level, the software level. Mine work is more at the level of the components or the actual physical devices. So there's a little bit of difference between that perspective and my perspective. But I think each has the ultimate same goal, as to make the functionality of the device more effective and more efficient.
Now, when you were at Georgia Tech, you founded a SHORE program to attract, more minority students. Talk to me about what inspired you to found that program, and maybe if you could also offer some context as to the demographic makeup of colleges back then. Was there a lot less minority students? Was that a big issue? It
was, and actually the motivation for SHORE actually dates back to when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and there weren't not many African American graduate students in engineering at that time, and probably still. And my colleagues and I, other graduate students, decided to start a summer program to attract more minority students to graduate school. And that program was called SUPERB, Summer Undergraduate Program of Engineering Research at Berkeley. And I think that program had only existed for a year or two before I graduated from Berkeley and went to Georgia Tech, but I wanted to do the same thing and sort of replicate myself and attract more graduate students of color into engineering, electrical engineering in my case. And so we started out with just electrical engineering, and then grew to the entire engineering college, all the disciplines in the engineering college, and then expanded to sciences as well. So the SHORE program still exists at Georgia Tech. Here is 25 years later, or whatever it is, maybe 30 years later. And it's been very successful. During the time I was there, we probably had several hundred students in the program, 400 or 500 students in the program. About 75% of those students went to graduate school, which was the goal of the program, to get them to graduate school. And maybe half of those went to graduate school at Georgia Tech, which is another one of the goals of the program. So,
what did founding and also managing that program teach you about maybe the best kind of way to attract minority students? Where there's kind of lessons there and maybe an evolution of how you thought about, the right way to attract minority students?
I think the most effective way is to have role models. So I was very keen on recruiting my fellow professors of color to be advisors in the program. Now, we didn't restrict it to professors of color. Anybody could be an advisor, but we also made it a priority to have graduate students as mentors in the program, and most of the graduate student mentors were also minority students. So I think the whole idea of being able to visualize yourself in those roles is what makes recruiting work, right? So you can see yourself as a graduate student at the place where you're participating, and you can see yourself maybe as a faculty member one day if you see people like you at that place.
Were there any sort of role models you had when you were undergraduate?
Yeah, mentoring was really important to me. In fact, it's funny, one of my primary mentors was a professor, Augustine Esseboy is his name. And he was the first black professor at Georgia Tech in engineering. I just saw him last week because I had a 60th birthday party. I just turned 60. And he was kind enough to, thank you. He was kind enough to travel here to Davis to attend the party, and I got to catch up with him. He's in his 80s now, so he's not traveling as much, and I was very honored that he made the trip just for me.
What do you think it is about role models that help people visualize their future?
Former Surgeon General Jocelyn Elder, she said, you can't be what you can't see. So I think just being able to see someone who you can relate to, similar background as you, looks like you, in a certain role, makes you want to try that out, whether that's sports or entertainment, or in my case, engineering. And up to the time when I had met Professor Esseboy, most of the successful African Americans I had either met or read about or seen on television maybe were either in athletics or entertainment. So it really was a new thing for me to see someone who was an engineer and basically was successful because of his intellect more than anything else. So that really got me very interested.
It's funny. I wonder if you observe this as often as it seems like I observe this, but it seems like a lot of times there's a person from a minority background and that's really successful in their own domain, and they want to support people, minorities in their own field, but they kind of struggle a bit to find what's the best way for them to sort of support minority students. And it's really cool, hearing you bring up role models and how it enables people to sort of like visualize themselves in the future, because I do think it's a very sort of like inexpensive way for a person that's very busy and accomplished to help people out,
Yeah, and you have to be visible and accessible and approachable and all those things. And I try to stay that way because otherwise, if it doesn't matter if you're a role model, nobody can find you, right?
Yeah.
So I try to have a presence on our campus and even broader nationally, so that students who might have some interest and may want to connect can do so.
Now, you also worked at AT&T Bell Laboratories as a technical staff member.
Yeah.
I couldn't find any more details about your involvement at Bell Laboratories, but, it's obviously very renowned, probably one of the most accomplished laboratories in human history, right?
Yeah, for a long time at Bell Labs, the company averaged 1 patent per day through its history. I was there summer of 85 and 86 because I had a fellowship from Bell Labs. It was called the Cooperative Research Fellowship Program. And part of the fellowship required you to do an internship during the summers while you're doing your graduate degrees. So I did that. And it was a really interesting place to work. A lot of very talented people, very smart people, Nobel laureates walking the halls. My boss's boss there, maybe the boss's boss's boss, I can't remember. But anyway, his name was Arno Penzias. And Arno was the guy who is known for, he measured the ambient temperature of the universe and basically, in some ways, proved the Big Bang Theory. And he was just, there sitting at his desk at Bell Labs. So that's the kind of caliber of person that you met during that experience. So that was really a wonderful experience for me.
Was there something distinct about the work culture at Bell Laboratories that you hadn't seen before?
Well, it was so free. I mean, it was not a typical company where they're trying to churn out product for the next quarter to make some sort of target revenue. Bell Labs was much like a university where everyone sort of worked on what they thought was interesting and didn't feel any pressure to make any money, at least at that time. I think it's changed since it was divested. Divestiture happened, I think, sometime late 80s. Anyway, at that time, the members of the technical staff, they were basically just like university professors working on research that interested them, that they could get the company to fund to buy equipment and supplies and things like that. And so that was a pretty liberating experience.
Were there any sort of like tidbits of wisdom passed on to you by people that may have mentored you worked with there that you can recall? Wow,
that was so long ago. Just, follow your passion. Do things that you think are interesting. Don't just do things for the sake of, money or recognition or whatever the reason might be. If you're not interested in it, it's not going to be fulfilling. So,
and, just to kind of round out our conversation about your research, if there's undergraduate researcher or maybe graduate researcher watching right now, what advice would you give them as far as doing great research? What do you think great research looks like?
Well, kind of related to what I've said, you find a mentor and try to benefit from their experience. Look around for a topic you're passionate about and kind of dive into it and try to find an experience where you can, exercise that passion prior to really committing to it. I think, in many ways, graduate research and being in graduate school is one of the better times of my life. I didn't think that at the time because I was pretty poor and all my friends were engineers and had graduated and had jobs and had money.
What made it one of the best times?
Well, just the fact that it was that liberation, right? You were free to do what you wanted to do as long as you were making progress toward your degree. And you didn't have really any strong responsibilities or bills or family responsibilities, things like that. So and I had a real cohort of really good friends at that time that we all were in the same situation and kind of supported each other.
I'd be curious if you agree with this, but it seems as though as a person progresses more and more through their career, they tend to take on roles where they have to manage their relationships with various stakeholders, and they can find themselves oftentimes in a very sort of restrictive position. Is that something that you've kind of like really sort of grappled with as you sort of progress in your career? And if maybe there's some advice?
Well, it is true as you progress in your career and become part of leadership in whatever organization, you are more restricted in what you can do, what you can say, what your time is devoted toward, because a lot of what your role is as a leader is solving the problems of other people in the organization, and that could be gathering resources and allocating those resources. It could be personal issues people are having. It often boils down to, in leadership, people and resources, and that's not the same as working on your integrated circuit manufacturing issue that you think is interesting, right? So,
yeah.
But it has to be done.
Is that sort of like different set of problems to solve? Is that something that you sort of like loved outright, or is it something that you sort of like grew to love as you progressed?
I was sort of steered into it. I mentioned the mentoring. In addition to the one mentor I talked about, I've had other mentors professionally who said, you'd be good in leadership. You should consider it. You should try it out. And I've had various experiences where I tried it and sort of stuck my toe in the water, and it seemed to be interesting, and it worked out and grew and evolved into in the role that I am in now.
Now, my favorite question to ask university administrators is what their definition of an ideal university is. How would you sort of define what makes up an ideal university, and maybe ways in which you sort of brought that vision here at UC Davis?
I think a university is, at least an R1, a Research 1 university, our role is discovery, right? So we're supposed to discover new thoughts, ideas, processes, et cetera, and then to communicate those in our classrooms and in our publications to the rest of the world, and use that as a means to serve society. So an ideal university is where you have all the freedom and resources to do that, right? So, and that's what we're all striving for, is to have enough of a community of scholars and resources so that everyone can pursue those ideas as far as they'd like to, and then to share those with the rest of the world.
Are there any ways in which your vision of an ideal university have evolved from like undergraduate experience to graduate to now being, Chancellor?
Well, I think when I was an undergraduate, I was fairly narrowly focused on, getting a degree to get a job, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's still important. I think you have to give our students have to have the tools they need to start their careers. But I think it's more than that as well, right? So it's also about this idea of discovery and finding out new things.
Yeah. Now, you became Chancellor early August 2017.
Mm-hmm.
What was the recruitment process like? How did you hear about the opportunity? How did sort of the interview process go? And then what was sort of like the onboarding process like of becoming Chancellor?
Yeah, it's surprisingly short. The first step is you get contacted by a recruitment firm, a search firm, and they are representing a committee, a search committee. We call them recruitment advisory committees here at the UC. But that committee has students, faculty, staff, alumni. It's usually pretty good size, maybe 20 people or so. And the search firm is their agent to source talent, to find out who would be a good fit for the role that they're trying to fill. So I got a call from a search firm, or maybe an email, can't remember, and said, "Would you be interested in interviewing for this job at UC Davis?" And I said yes, obviously. And this was around January of 2017, and I went to the interview, which was where was the interview? I think it was in San Francisco.
In person?
In person, yeah. With this committee. It was about a 2-hour process. And when I left, a couple of weeks later, I got another call from the search firm saying I'd, done well, impressed the committee, and they wanted to follow up. And I had discussion with the president of the system at that time, who was Janet Napolitano, and eventually received an offer around March. So it's a really short process, 2 months.
How do you prepare for an interview to become Chancellor? What did that kind of process look like?
That's a good question. At the time, honestly, I didn't think I was going to get the job because I was a dean at the time, and usually in academia, an expectation is that you're a provost before you become a president or chancellor. And so as a dean, I was doing the interview just as practice. I didn't think it was going to work out this way. To prepare, you try to learn as much as you can about the university, its various strengths and weaknesses and rankings, and all this financial data and the people who are there, and history and traditions and all those. You learn as much as you can, and then you try to align that with your own interests and passions and things that you want to achieve as a leader, and then you try to express that during your interview.
Now, I think in any setting, it's reasonable to expect that a person you're interviewing for a role, there's something you see in them that you think makes them have a certain kind of aptitude for the role, right?
Yeah.
Was there an idea in that moment when you're interviewing of what it is about you that may have been sort of like making you attractive as a candidate from them? And if there wasn't, is there sort of a conclusion you've arrived to now that you've been at Davis of like, oh, wow, now I'm seeing, this quality of mine has really enabled me to do great work here. And I didn't realize that at the beginning.
I think in addition to all the background research you do on the place, I think in the interview process, it's important to be able to relate to the people that are talking to you and asking you questions. And I think I'm a pretty empathetic, high EQ sort of person. I think that probably showed in the interview process. And I think based on the recent history of the university, I think they were looking for a leader like that. There had been some dysfunction with previous leadership, and I think there was a desire to have someone who could relate to the student body, who could sort of heal that dysfunction, and be sort of a transparent, trusted, approachable leader with a vision. And I think I expressed some vision, things I'd like to do, places where I'd like to take the university.
It's interesting you mentioned EQ. I wonder, what do you think drives EQ? Do you think it's like curiosity? Do you think it's being a great analyzer of the position and sort of perspective of other people, or maybe like a combination of both? Maybe
a combination. I think some of it is innate. I think some people are just naturally high EQ people. But I do think you can also learn it. You can, do leadership training and have some experiences that improve your ability to relate to people. I've always been, pretty comfortable around other people, even though I think I'm an introvert, which most people don't believe when I say that. But I think some of it came naturally and some of it came from the experiences I'd had as a leader prior to my interview.
Now, in 2018, you created 3 task forces to address food insecurity, housing, and healthcare here at Davis. I think it'd be great if you could kind of walk us through your process of deciding when an issue needs to be addressed with a task force, as well as how you create the task force, decide who's in the task force, and sort of like manage it until the project, is carried out completion. Yeah.
So when I came in 2017, there was a definite need for basic needs, to be addressed, student basic needs, which were food insecurity, housing, and mental health. And since I'm not an expert in any of those areas, what I try to do is lean on the expertise we have on the campus. So I formed groups that had that expertise and could represent the appropriate, constituents, the students and faculty and staff, and study the problems that we were having and give me some recommendations. And that's where the task force idea came in. And ultimately, it led to some permanent things that happened at the university. We have a basic needs center, which we call the Aggie Compass, which addresses food insecurity and rapid rehousing and other basic needs that students have. We have a separate mental health task force that it's not a task force anymore. It's kind of a permanent fixture that is designed to make sure our students are getting the proper care mentally, as well as everything else that's available physically and educationally. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that we were able to address those issues and have some, stable, permanent solutions. And I'm not saying we're perfect. We can always improve in all those areas, but I am proud that we've made some real progress.
Now, my understanding of the task force is that there's a lot of involvement from faculty, right?
There is, but not just faculty, staff, students, all participated in those task forces.
Yeah, because when I was on the drive over here, I was thinking about, what would addressing an issue in a corporate context look like, right? It would probably maybe involve sourcing a consulting firm and so outsourcing the burden of the analysis work to a third party. And I was thinking, there's something very unique in that you can have people a professor of agriculture come and evaluate for the food situation and have them actually be a person that's integrated into the community and have them be a personal stakeholder. Is that something, special in a university that you kind of recognize when you're doing task force?
Well, I think you recognize that you don't necessarily need to hire a consultant because you have the expertise on site. So in the case of food insecurity, we had nutrition experts, for example, that were able to serve on the task force. I think the chair of the task force was one of our nutrition faculty. And so similarly, people that understand economics of housing and those sorts of things could make good recommendations on how to both build affordable housing and make it available to our students in a reasonable amount of time. So you could augment that with consultants if you need to. Consultants are not cheap. We didn't have a lot of extra money to throw around at these problems, so I wanted to try to see what we could do with what we had before I hired consultants.
Now, I'm recalling my conversation with Lynn Mahoney, president of SF State. Mm-hmm. And part of the conversation was covering her experience sort of like running the university and responding to COVID, because she became, president very close to sort of the beginning of the pandemic. And I'd love to kind of give you an opportunity to kind of like provide us with your perspective of how you sort of like addressed it. What were those first kind of like weeks like when the pandemic started, and maybe how did the university's response to the pandemic sort of evolve as the pandemic evolved, 1, 2, 3 years after?
So I think in the beginning we were all scrambling, including UC Davis, and we didn't really know what we were facing and how it would impact the university. But I'm really proud of how we responded ultimately, because we developed an initiative which we ended up calling Healthy Davis Together. And at the core of the program was, and again, we used expertise that was available on our campus. We had an expert in plant genomics, and his name is Richard Mitchellmore, and he adapted a machine that did sequencing for ag genomics to be able to do the PCR test to detect the COVID virus, right, and do it quickly. So we were able to adapt the process and buy a couple of machines that would do it, and did tens of thousands of tests a week, maybe a day. I can't remember. I think it was a week. So we were able to acquire those machines. We built an infrastructure for people to go do their tests regularly and get the results back within 24 to 48 hours. We hired what we called ambassadors, student ambassadors, public health ambassadors, I think we called them, to sort of roam around the campus and the community saying, wear your mask, stay 6 feet apart, all those sorts of things that the protocol required to keep us healthy. We had some funds for small businesses in the Davis area to keep them healthy while they were, when they weren't able to have customers. And all this was possible because of some philanthropy, some internal resources, and some federal resources that we all put together. And it was just a tremendous success. We did some modeling, and I think we kept thousands of people from going to the hospital. The model said we saved dozens of lives. People that would have otherwise died from COVID did not, because of our program. So I think it won some national awards and became a model for the country.
Now, were you guys like manufacturing those kits here?
Yes and no. So we had to buy a lot of the infrastructure to do the tests, and put it together here. But the actual test itself was happening here on our campus in our genome center.
Oh, and that was just unique to Davis. It was just something special here.
Yeah. And we made it available to not just the university, but the city of Davis and Yolo County, the school districts. We made it widely available. So we kept people healthy and safe here for the duration of the pandemic.
What about sort of like the communications perspective and communicating to students? How did that kind of evolve?
That was a very important part of the program. We had experts in how to get the messages out and how to make it more, what's the right word?
Palatable, maybe? I don't know.
Palatable to the young people. That's why we had these ambassadors, right? Because they were peers that could help get the required public health messages out to students who were maybe in the dorms or elsewhere, and try to build up healthy habits. So,
were you having a lot of conversations with sort of school administrators in other schools? Was there kind of like a coordinated effort to share sort of like wisdom and insights?
There were some other universities that were doing similar things. Notably, I remember Illinois was doing something very similar. There were just a handful. Ultimately, more and more tried to kind of adopt the same approach. Locally, we did certainly talk to our friends within the Sacramento region to assist as best we could. I think we were able to give some useful help, recommendations and advice.
Now, about a month ago, you gave a talk at an executive leadership program where you described your leadership methodology as one that really champions self-awareness. Mm-hmm. how would you describe your leadership methodology to those, in the audience that are unfamiliar? And are there any ways your thoughts on leadership have kind of evolved over the years and becoming a more experienced leader?
I think I have a lot of opinions about the attributes of a good leader. I would start with, we talked about EQ earlier, but I think empathy is so important. And I think self-awareness, not taking yourself too seriously, sort of being able to understand the perspective of the people that you're leading and trying to build consensus that way, not having to be right all the time. So, I tell my leadership team here, I really believe in being dissent. And if you disagree with me, I don't need yes people. I need people who really can feel confident in what they're saying and have some discussion about whatever the issue is before we decide what we're going to do. Transparency is important. I don't like surprises, and I try not to surprise people. Just collegiality. No one's going to be an expert in everything, and no one of us is as smart as all of us, right? So I try to have that approach when I build and operate with our leadership team.
You mentioned an attribute that I really personally sort of connect with and love, which is a comfort with dissent.
Mm-hmm.
I think, my personal opinion is that like universities, a really important sort of like aspect of a great university environment is a sort of comfort with scrutiny. Mm-hmm. Like as a student, you should want to go into a classroom and have your ideas scrutinized and learn what it means to scrutinize other ideas,
right,
and learn how to do that in an empathetic, but also sort of like effective and productive and articulate way, right? From my perspective, it seems like one of the great ways to foster that kind of environment is to lead by example and kind of like have the administrators sort of be as comfortable with scrutiny as they would want the students to be.
Sure.
Is that kind of a big driver for your sort of like focus on being comfortable with dissent as well?
I think so. I think, this all comes back to not being, to having some humility, not having a big ego, and recognizing that you're not going to get everything right all the time, and other people have valuable input to contribute. So I think, that's one of the things we try to foster in our students as well, both in their classroom and ultimately their careers, is that they're going to be needing to have support people and colleagues around them that they're going to be successful. That's how you make progress, really, right? So.
Yeah, and I'd love to connect that to sort of like your views on freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways does freedom of speech kind of create value, but also present challenges, at a public university? What are your thoughts on the optimal way of handling issues of free speech from the
you can't, unless people are free to express themselves, again, you're not going to be able to make progress. And so that means not just the people that agree with you. So the hardest part, I think, that people have with free speech is speech that might be offensive or threatening or, somehow uncomfortable. And you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's a hard thing to learn. It's part of the development process. I don't know that I'm perfect at it yet, but, we've had most of this discussion around free speech centers around people that come to campus to give speeches or presentations. And we've had, in the years that I've been here, people from all aspects of the political spectrum. And that hasn't always been easy because there's been some really strong objections to some of the people that have come to visit us. But I think it's really important to let them have their say. And if you want to rebut it. But you let them, everyone gets to have their say. And so it may make you feel personally uncomfortable and you may disagree with it, but you don't have to go. And you could also rebut it. So that's how we approach things.
I think a big narrative is that younger generations are much less tolerant of sort of like divergent views. Does your personal experience kind of corroborate that narrative or sentiment? How has that kind of like evolved? Because you've been around universities for a while, right?
I think that's very true. I think social media has a lot to do with that. We're all kind of in our social media bubbles, talking with people that agree with us all the time. And then when somebody doesn't agree, it's kind of shocking and disturbing. If you think about it, people in my generation, free speech was Martin Luther King Jr. and, Cesar Chavez, and people that were, free speech was a positive thing. And now for your generation, it's guys with tiki torches in Charlottesville, right? Saying things that are just, not as positive, in my opinion. So I think the way that people evaluate free speech has generationally changed, where it was, if you're in your 50s or 60s like me, it's a positive. If you're in your 20s and 30s, maybe not so much, right?
Yeah. And I think things get very tricky when you try to differentiate between hateful speech and threatening speech, right?
Yeah.
And, I love to connect that to the Harvard and UPenn dean controversy at the end of 2023. Was this like a story you were following of, this issue of when does the expression of concern regarding the aggressiveness of the Israeli military dip into actually being anti-Semitic speech that's threatening to, Jewish students?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the answers. I will say this. I think hate speech, so-called hate speech, is still free speech. It's free expression, even though it's unpleasant. That doesn't mean you can make threats. That's different. You can't make threats to anyone or any group or individual. So, and that's a difficult line to draw sometimes, right? So I think it's perfectly reasonable, and this is Gary's opinion, not any, I'm not a scholar in this area, perfectly reasonable for me to criticize Israel's approach to something without being anti-Semitic. But where you draw that line is sort of a challenge, and some people feel differently. Some people have expressed, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I don't personally hold that view, but I've heard that view expressed. So,
yeah, and I think an interesting way to reframe how one should look at hate speech is that there's actually there's like a very big opportunity that lies whenever hate speech is expressed, because it's typically expressed in a public forum, and that allows others to scrutinize it and dispel it in front of the people who might actually agree with that hate speech.
Yeah, right.
And I wish more universities kind of embedded that framing of hate speech into how they sort of like communicated their policies on speech to students.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not easy, though. I mean, people, like I said, it's unpleasant. So when someone's espousing some view that you personally find objectionable or offensive, it's hard to listen to it. Even if you want to have a chance to argue with them or rebut them, you just don't. Some people just don't want to hear it and don't want to be around it. And I have the view that even somebody who's expressing something unpleasant, there may be a kernel of truth in there that I can benefit from. So I try to force myself to see where they're coming from. And at least that, if nothing else, it allows me to delve into that point of view a little bit further and either reinforce or question my own point of view, right?
I wonder how much one's willingness to engage with and also, like facilitate and distribute scrutiny is connected to EQ and one's ability to sort of empathize with the position of others,
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, but it may be very closely related.
Yeah. Now I want to get into sort of, in the past couple of weeks, UCD Pulp has been involved in setting up encampments here in protest of Israel's aggressive military policy. I'd love to learn about your sort of approach to handling these kinds of demonstrations. How does a university chancellor, think about the right way to respond or facilitate?
Yeah, I think
safety?
I sent a statement out immediately when the encampment was formed, supporting the right of the students to express themselves freely, and we'll stand by that as long as there's no violence or vandalism or things that we can't tolerate. Now, there's a fine line there. There are policy issues that will ultimately have to be decided. In theory, you can't camp on the quad, right? It's a policy violation. But we're trying to give the students a little room to given the amount of pain and suffering that they felt as Palestinian or pro-Palestinian or Muslim or Arab students, and we're trying to figure out a way to resolve the issues and respond to the requests that they've made in a way that's acceptable to the entire campus. It may not be something that everyone agrees with, but at least responds to the concerns they've expressed.
Yeah, and earlier we touched on how difficult it is to differentiate between speech that's hateful and offensive versus speech that's actually threatening. And I think, this line of demonstrations, when does a demonstration sort of cross the line into it being threatening, is even more blurry.
Yeah.
How do you think about deducing when a student demonstration crosses the line? Is it when they're disrupting classes, when they're maybe sort of posturing themselves in a very aggressive way towards students? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think disrupting classes certainly is over the line. I think when you're interrupting the egress or ingress or egress to buildings and things like that, or occupying buildings, I think that crosses the line. Certainly when you vandalize a building or structure, violence is an obvious crossing of the line. All those kind of things are not acceptable, even if you're doing it in the name of protest. I think, It's one of these back in my day kind of comments. But, I was a bit of an activist as a student, but I always had a real objective in mind to my activism. Like I wanted this particular thing to occur. And so anything, it wasn't just throwing a tantrum. It was, I wanted the university or whoever I was directing the activism toward to take a particular action. So I think that's constructive. I think that's how we make progress and move forward. I think, as much as it causes headaches for me, it pushes the envelope, pushes the conversation, pushes the discussion in a way that wouldn't happen if the protest was not happening.
Yeah. Now, at my university, SF State, there were some encampments for a while. And I think, the president met with them, and I think she met sort of like 3 out of the 4 of their demands. And it made me think a lot about what is the best way for a university administrator to engage with sort of like the demands of a student protest.
Yeah.
Well, what's your kind of like approach to engaging and maybe negotiating?
I don't know if there's a best way. I can tell you what we're doing. We have a small team of campus leaders who are engaging with the leadership of the camp, and they're having discussions. They've had 2 or 3 meetings now around their requests. I don't like demands. Mm-hmm. My only demand is there are no demands. But anyway, they're having those discussions, and we hope to reach some kind of peaceful resolution at some point.
Now, UC Davis is really unique in its respect to sort of like its economic and geographic significance here in the city of Davis. You know, there are college towns, Berkeley comes to mind, but Berkeley doesn't have as much of an economic and geographic influence in the city of Berkeley as Davis.
Right.
In what ways does this make your role as chancellor here very unique relative to sort of the roles of chancellors of other universities?
So that's a very astute observation. So there would be no Davis if it wasn't for the university, I think. The population of the city of Davis is about 70,000. The university is about 40,000 students and 25,000 employees. Well, that's including Davis and Sacramento. At any rate, so my role is as much university leader as it is mayor and CEO and principal and all those kind of things rolled into one, because the university is basically a municipality in and of itself. We have our own fire department and police department and all those sorts of things that the universities would use the resources of the city they're in. And we cooperate and collaborate with the city as well in many areas.
Now, the more I learn about Davis and the more you sort of like contextualize university and the city, in this conversation, it makes me think just how excellent of a stakeholder manager the person that is chancellor at this university has to be. What can you say about what it means to sort of like manage stakeholder interests, in an effective way?
You have to be a good listener and kind of understand where people are coming from and be able to express your rationale about decision making and why you do things the way you decide to do them, even if they disagree. You have to have sort of broad interests and knowledge, and you don't necessarily have that all in your own head. Sometimes it comes from the leadership team that you surround yourself with, recognize that you're not going to be right 100% of the time, and try to do the best you can and to do the best for the most people, if that makes sense.
Do you think about it kind of like you? There's like a list of stakeholders you have to account for. Mm-hmm. You listen and emphasize to what their preferences would be, and you kind of like build a mental model where you maximize the positive emotion every party would feel by making sort of like a given decision. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Somewhat, yeah. I think, first of all, you have to keep in mind what your mission is. Your mission is to educate students, do the research, and do the service. So you can't stray too far from that. But in the context of that overarching mission, you do want to think about the mental model of the various constituencies, the way you described it.
Yeah, and in our preparation for our time together, I spoke with my 2 best friends that come here to UC Davis, who mentioned the requested mascot change from Gunrock to the cow. And I thought this topic would actually be a great way for us to, explore your role as a stakeholder manager, but actually with like an example. So what was that kind of experience like for you?
I heard about it sort of midway through the movement. Mm-hmm. And I thought, it was kind of a fun and interesting initiative that the students started. I think one thing is that they didn't take into account early on or even later on was how alumni were going to feel, and because alumni were pretty strongly against the change of the mascot. And you can imagine traditions and all that means a lot more to people who are here years and years ago than it does to current students. The other thing I think they didn't really calibrate very well is the cost. To change all of the insignias on all of the merchandise and all the the websites and all of the book, on and on and on. It was not going to be free, and nobody had any extra money to do this. So, so we figured out a way to compromise. I think that we used the cow selectively on different in different instances, but not as the overall mascot. The overall mascot remains the Gunrock, the horse.
Yeah. So to sort of round out our conversation, I'd love to get into AI and future of college education.
Yeah.
How do you anticipate the makeup of university faculty and curriculum to change in the coming years, given the proliferation and improvement of AI?
Well, I'm hoping, and I think this is going to be true, it'll make our jobs easier in many ways. A lot of the report writing and compliance and other things that you have to do around research and even in some requirements around teaching gets easier when you have AI as an assistant or as the primary engine behind it. It's going to force us to think differently about our jobs and how to approach our job and how do we add value as a human intelligence to things that could be done reasonably well by a bot or an AI. I don't think we've scratched the surface yet on what that's going to look like, but I'm very positive. I'm not one of these people that's sort of alarmist and thinking AI is going to, Skynet is not going to take over and destroy us. So, I'm much more optimistic about AI and its applications.
Have you personally messed around with any large language models yourself?
No, nothing more than just asking ChatGPT to do silly stuff, right?
Yeah.
Write a poem about Gary May that has these attributes. I have not yet used it. I like to write myself. I could see myself eventually getting to the point where I might use a large language model to give me a first draft, but I haven't really done that yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you saw OpenAI's model of the 4.0 sort of like voice mode a couple weeks ago, but there was this crazy video where the voice or the vocalization of like the actual text has become so human-like, and they created this feature where you give a kid an iPad, right, and the kid's learning, say, geometry, what a hypotenuse is and the sorts, right, and they have the large language model to their left kind of guiding them through it.
Yeah.
And you can have like 28 kids on an iPad, and after a kid has an hour-long session for their geometry class, it provides the teacher a summary of sort of like what the kid learned, what the kids struggle with, and then it also like averages out what did most kids struggle with, what did some kids do best at, and it can even like identify which kids are the most gifted at like a given subject. And it's been making me think a lot about how much like leaner universities can run having systems like that.
That's what I mean, how it can be such an assistance to us in our jobs. And you can think about having a personalized education as opposed to teaching a class. The AI can teach you what you need and account for deficiencies in your own learning, things that you do well versus things you don't do well, as opposed to sort of the instructor having to teach to the median of the class. You can have just like personalized medicine, right? Responds to what your body needs with respect to its own genetic makeup. You can have a personalized education using an AI assistant.
Overall, would you characterize yourself as optimistic or pessimistic?
Optimistic.
Optimistic? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's funny. I hear people talk about how scary it is of sort of like the effects it'll have in job displacement, right? And in my mind, and this is just a guess, I'm like a naive 21-year-old that's just like using these, right? But it seems like it'll be a big enabler of allowing us to focus on what matters.
Yeah, it'll do two things. It'll change jobs. Some jobs will be quote unquote eliminated, but that doesn't mean there's still not work to be done. But it will also improve the quality of life overall. So, it wasn't so long ago the 40-hour work week was a crazy thing. And, people used to work 60, 70, 80 hours. You can imagine sometime in the future where a work week is 20 hours or less, and we're doing other things that are improved that represent an improved quality of life.
Yeah, and it's funny, the whole term of 40-hour work week, like, I know it's called the 40-hour work week, but are there actually like 40 very productive hours? Or like in knowledge work, is there actually like 15 hours that really matter? And others are more sort of like administrative grunge work,
It's a great question. I suspect all 40 hours are not productive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Chancellor May, I've really enjoyed our conversation. The closing question I ask every guest is, if you were 21 years old at this current moment, what fields would you study? What problems would you aim to solve? I
think I would still be in engineering. If I was 20, I've had a lot of fulfillment out of that career. I don't know if I'd necessarily be the same type of engineer. I tell people when I was starting out, there was no such thing as biomedical engineering. Mm-hmm. So that's something I'm interested in and would probably think about pursuing today if I was just starting, as opposed to 40 years ago when I was starting. So
cool. Well, Chancellor, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
This is Atlas by Juan Martinez. To stay up to date, follow Juan on Instagram and X. To watch condensed highlights and shorts of the show, visit the Atlas Clips channel. Your viewership is greatly appreciated.